Welcome to the latest episode of the Real World Nutrition Podcast. This is episode 215, Deconstructing Food Labels, Marketing, Misleading Claims, and Red Flags. Hi everyone, welcome back to the latest episode of Real World Nutrition. Today's episode is the second in a two-part series on deconstructing food labels. Now, in last week's episode, or the last episode, I addressed the required and regulated parts of the label. That's the information you can count on because it is backed by law. When I say count on, it's going to be consistent across all food packaged food because there's required information. So today, I'm talking about the other side of food labels, and that's more of the marketing, the buzzwords, the flat-out misleading claims that often sound healthy or better for you, but really don't mean much. Food manufacturers are expert in language. Actually, anybody who's in marketing, they're experts in language. They know what makes you stop and think, this one's healthier. Now, when we're talking about some of these words, they're not lies. They're used in ways that make you think you're buying something better than you really are. So I say they're truth but misleading. So I'm going to start with one of the most overused for words in food marketing is natural. So this could be natural, all natural, 100% natural. And really, this one drives me crazy. There is no consistent official definition for natural on most foods. For meat, poultry, and eggs, there is some guidance, and that just means there's no artificial ingredients and minimal processing. So, for example, you're buying chicken, that's natural, minimal processing. If you're buying chicken nuggets, there's more processing there. But with everything else regarding this term natural, it's wide open. So take a bag of processed snack chips, remove a color additive, and call them natural Cheetos. So the natural Cheetos, still Cheetos. They just have a color additive removed, and it doesn't turn your fingers bright orange. Peanut butter labeled natural might still have added sugar and palm oil. That's where you look at the ingredients list that I mentioned last week. Even a beer like Bud Light can technically be labeled natural because it's made from basic ingredients. And I've seen it advertised that way. I've seen it in grocery stores that have prestige pricing on things because people believe things are healthier. Now, natural doesn't mean healthy. It doesn't even mean less processed, except for when we're, again, talking meat, poultry, and eggs. It just means they've followed through or followed enough loose rules to make it sound better. So again, to clarify, if I'm buying natural Cheetos, I'm still buying Cheetos, and the only thing that's natural about it is that the color has changed. So bottom line, I tell people this all the time. You may want to follow this one, but really ignore that word. Look at the ingredients list instead. So don't be drawn in by that word natural without looking at the ingredients list. And this may seem obvious, but Cheetos are never going to be considered healthy. Now, organic does have more structure behind it, but it does still get misused. So organic refers to how something was grown or raised. It does not mean the food is healthier. It doesn't mean fewer calories. It does not mean more nutrients. People want to insist that is true, that there are more nutrients, that it is healthier, but it's not. It just means the farmer followed certain practices. No synthetic fertilizers. They still use fertilizers. That's a big misperception here. They don't use synthetic fertilizers, and they have certain pesticides restrictions. They still use pesticides. So again, certain practices tightly regulated. So yes, organic farms use pesticides and fertilizers. This is another one that drives me crazy because people tell me, oh, they don't use pesticides. Yes, they do. Okay. So again, it's how it's grown or raised. And honestly, not just honestly, truthfully, some organic farms use more pesticides than conventional farms, depending on what they're growing. Now, if you prefer to buy organic for environmental or personal reasons, of course, do that. But as I say, organic brownies are still brownies. Organic sugar is still sugar. It's not any better. Now, I alluded to this one in last week's episode, made with whole grains. Now, this sounds promising, but it means almost nothing. So a product only needs to contain some whole grains to make this claim. Even if it's just a spoonful mixed with refined flour, they can still advertise it. I came across one of the facilities I go to, Rice Krispie treats that were made with whole grain. I did a side-by-side comparison of the regular Rice Krispie treats and this made with whole grain Rice Krispie treats. Virtually no difference. It was one still a Rice Krispie treat. One was made with brown rice, but it was no healthier. It was not healthier. And the fiber difference was 1 gram. So made with whole grain doesn't have that meaning people think it is. If you want to eat more whole grains, skip the front of the package, flip it over, and check the ingredients list. You've heard this before. The first ingredient should be something like whole wheat flour, brown rice, or oats. And here's a bonus tip. There's a whole grain stamp from the Whole Grains Council. It's sometimes very small, but it's a little yellowish orange, and it looks like a postage stamp. It can be very small, but it's on foods that are made with whole grains, and it has a certain percentage of it being whole grains, from 80% to 100%, or saying whole grain rich. And again, that has some flexibility. So always read the list, the ingredients list. Another one that I mentioned briefly in last week's episode was low carb. Another one with no legal definition. It can mean whatever the company decides, because there is no specific standard from the FDA on how many grams count as low. So as I mentioned last week, we do have definitions for low fat, low sodium, low calorie, but there is no definition for low carb. So whatever that means to you, you need to check. So many plant foods naturally have carbs, not just many plant foods, all plant foods. All plant foods, carbohydrates come from plants. So carbs are not the enemy. So when a label is screaming low carb, it's trying to tap into whatever diet trend is happening at the moment. Keto, paleo, low carb. It's marketing, not science. And I also see things that are listed as low carb that would not have high carbohydrate in the first place, or any carbohydrate in the first place. So the real question is this: how does that food fit into your overall pattern of eating, not what the front of the box claims? Now, another one, I mentioned just one of these the other day in last week's episode: reduced fat, low fat, fat-free. So these do have definitions. So low fat is less than 3 grams of total fat per serving. Fat-free, as I mentioned in last week's episode, has less than half a gram per serving. And then reduced fat is 25% less than the regular version. So if something had 10 grams of fat, If it has less than 7, that's 25% less, at least in my brain math, that's allowed to say reduced fat. But here's the problem. Not a problem, just be aware. Taking out fat often means something else is added. Often sugar or sodium, sometimes sugar and sodium. So I tell people sugar, fat, and sodium, these are 3 things that provide flavor. So if one's removed, the other 2 tend to increase. So for example, reduced fat peanut butter may be reduced fat. So it may have less of the healthy fat, but just as many calories because there's more sugar, and salt doesn't have calories, but there's more salt in it too. So if you're choosing lower fat options, check the rest of the label before assuming it's better. Sometimes it's just different. I used to have, I think it was fat-free fig Newtons compared to regular fig Newtons. It might have been reduced fat. I honestly don't recall. The difference was 10 calories per serving, not per cookie, per serving. It was minimal. It was virtually no different. So again, look at the, not just the label, the rest of the label, but maybe a side by side there. Now, one more here, no added sugar. So this one is another one that is technically true. It can be technically true, but easy to misunderstand. So no added sugar doesn't mean the food has no sugar. Fruit, milk, and yogurt will contain sugar naturally. The label no added sugar just means none was added during processing. Now, something that I notice a lot, and I love dates, but sometimes dates are an ingredient and they provide a lot of sweetness. No added sugar because that's fruit, but it's still got a lot of naturally occurring sugar in there. Now, some of these foods also will use sugar alcohols or artificial sweeteners instead. And that's fine for plenty of people, but I just need to say heads up, sugar alcohols can cause digestive issues for many people. And then consider this, that honey, agave, or maple syrup, they're still added sugars, no matter how natural they sound. People ask me, well, aren't they healthier? No, they're not. And it actually, teaspoon for teaspoon, tablespoon for tablespoon, they can have more calories in them compared to white sugar. So when you see no added sugar, ask yourself what's actually in it. Now, I want to switch gears a bit to non-GMO claims, because this deserves its own section. So at first glance, non-GMO sounds like a good thing. People assume it means the product is free of genetically modified organisms and that it's healthier. But that's not really what it means. First up, the truth is, only about a dozen crops are genetically modified in the United States. A dozen. Some of them we don't even eat ourselves. So things like corn, soybeans, sugar beets, canola, papaya, and some potatoes or squash. There is also alfalfa, but last I checked, I don't know any humans that eat alfalfa. So those dozen crops are the only ones that would be GMO. There is no GMO wheat. There are no GMO bananas. There's no GMO carrots. I could go on and on and on about all kinds of foods that are not GMO. No GMO peanuts. So if you see a bag of raisins labeled non-GMO, it's not that someone went out of their way to grow the grapes without genetically modified organisms. It's that raisins or grapes never had them to begin with. There is no raisin or grape crops that are GMO. So that label is just there for marketing. Now, sometimes the non-GMO label will make sense, like sugar. where it'll tell you that it came from sugar cane instead of sugar beets, since the beets can be a GMO, but sugar cane is not. Now, most often these sugars are a mix of sugar cane and sugar beets. But if this is important to you, that's something you can pay attention to. But a non-GMO label on a bottle of water, which I have seen, is absurd and pointless. Water is water, for crying out loud, okay? And the non-GMO Project verified butterfly logo, so if you look, you might see the little butterfly logo that says non-GMO Project. And it's the most common certification you'll see, but even that label doesn't mean the product is completely free from genetic modification. It just means the company followed the program's verification standards. And in a laboratory setting, they most likely would not be able to tell if there was a GMO ingredient or not. A lot of brands pay for the label, that non-GMO Project butterfly logo label, even when the risk of GMO is almost zero. Again, like peanuts, aren't GMO, but the sugar oil added to some brands might come from GMO crops. But a reality check here. This is so much a common thing that I encounter. Some people worry about whether their beer or wine is non-GMO. Some people worry about whether their beer or wine is organic. And that's fine if it's important to you, but I need to make this 100% clear. No question, alcohol itself is a carcinogen. Alcohol is a known human carcinogen. So if your IPA is non-GMO, seriously, it's probably not the biggest concern or even relevant. Okay, so bottom line here. When you're at the grocery store, remember this. Front of the package claims are designed to catch your attention, not necessarily guide your health. Some terms are regulated and useful. Others are just noise. Natural, low carb, non-GMO often mean less than what many people think. So when in doubt, flip it over. The nutrition facts panel and the ingredients list are where you're going to find the real information. And if you're not sure if that reduced fat is worth it, get it side by side with the original version. If you're not sure if that whole grain made with whole grain Rice Krispie treat is worth it, that one should be pretty obvious. But do a side-by-side comparison, and you'll see a lot of times there's virtually no difference. So, if there's anything you take from this two-part series, let it be this. The front of the package is marketing. The back of the package contains useful information. Okay? So, with that wraps up this series. So for links to both parts of this series or last week's episode and the original blog post, check out the show notes. As always, thank you so much for tuning into Real World Nutrition. Join me again next week and every Friday for a new episode. And if you have an idea for a topic, let me know. If I haven't covered it before or I need to revisit it, I will definitely review the information and add it to the 2026 queue of podcast topics I'll do. All right, everyone, you take care and bye for now.